Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another video, but this video is going to be a bit different because I'm taking a snippet out of my longer video on whether or not creatine causes hair loss. The purpose of this video is to examine the anecdotal reports on how long it takes for creatine to cause any sort of shedding. Now, in this particular context, we're looking at two studies. The first study being the 2009 rugby player study that a lot of people for the better part of a decade have been saying that, oh, look, this is a piece of evidence that shows creatine can accelerate androgenetic alopecia. Why? Because, well, it increases DHT. Now, the problem with this particular study is that the increases in DHT were not significant enough or supraphysiologically significant enough to accelerate any sort of androgenetic alopecia. That being the case that it was in normal ranges for the men in that particular age group. And that was university, college-age males. There were also some potential confounders as well, because strength training itself can also increase androgenic activity. So depending on when they did the blood work, that could actually impact the results. But the problem with that study is that it was, from what I remember, 2 to 3 weeks long. It was a very short study. However, that didn't stop people from using it as a good piece of evidence to essentially say creatine can accelerate androgenetic alopecia and potentially cause it for it to happen, the onset to happen in people that take creatine. Now, we have an even better study that seems to be getting more criticism than the 2009 rugby player study. And this is the Locke and colleagues study that essentially asks the question, with the title of the study being, quote, "Does creatine cause hair loss? A 12-week randomized controlled trial," unquote. Now, this study is specifically looking at creatine in a dermatological context, as opposed to the 2009 rugby player study by Vandermeer et al., looking at creatine then in a strength training context. So I don't understand the criticism. I do understand the criticism when it comes to Locke and colleagues, because people say that the study was too short. It was 3 months. Conventionally speaking, a lot of hair loss studies are 6 months in length. And to that, I kind of agree with you guys. Because if it was a bit longer, it would have put all of this, or most of this dispute to rest. But there's one particular part that people seem to be ignoring, is that, again, your justification for the rugby player study is that, well, it raises DHT, but you ignore the fact that it was a very, very short window, a fraction of what Locke and colleagues did. And also you ignore the fact that there were no hair metrics being observed to at least give a signal that creatine was causing hair loss in that 2009 rugby player study. Yet that did not stop people, and it continues to not stop people from citing that particular paper. A paper that has nothing to do with dermatology and strictly in the context of strength training. A strength of the Locke and colleague paper is that they were tracking DHT for 3 months. And if we're using the justification that creatine accelerates hair loss because the rugby player 2009 study showed that, hey, it was increasing DHT, so that means it accelerates AGA, androgenetic alopecia. This study is longer, and it did not show a statistically significant between the two groups. So it's kind of throwing dirt in the whole concept that creatine is accelerating androgenetic alopecia by virtue of upregulating DHT production, potentially by upregulating 5-alpha reductase enzymatic activity. This study didn't note that. But then people say, well, they didn't measure DHT in the tissue. Well, let's think about this critically. Serum DHT is based off of tissue DHT leaking into the serum. If there's less tissue DHT, then there should be less serum DHT. So what's going on here? If creatine is increasing DHT in the tissues, then there should be more serum DHT, just by virtue of serum DHT being based off of the tissue DHT that leaks into the blood. So again, you really can't have it both ways. Now, we can't say that they're a one-to-one. Obviously, they're not a one-to-one. There's more tissue DHT concentration than there is in the serum, right? Because DHT is a paracrine hormone, so most of it is going to be in tissues rather than in the serum. But you should see some kind of indication that if it's raising it in the tissue, then there should be more essentially being put back into the blood, right? There should be a raise in DHT in the blood. There was none. That was statistically significant. That could be tied to the creatine's intervention, because between the creatine and the placebo group, it was pretty much the same. And you'll always have people that will make ad populum sort of remarks, and that's an appeal to popularity, where they will say, well, who cares about the studies? We just care about what people are saying online. The majority, quote unquote, the majority, I don't know how they quantify that, but the majority of people and what they're saying. Well, if we want to use ad populum to say that, one study is good and the other study is bad, why not use ad populum to show the amount of time it takes for people to report shedding on creatine? And this is what this video is going to be showing. The ad populum appeal does not work here because most people are reporting shedding literally at 0 days all the way up to 3 months. So if you're going to use ad populum, I use Trestless as a model over here, but I'm sure if you use other subreddits, the data will be the same. Ad populum will show that the Lock-in colleagues paper is valid in using a 3-month marker, because the ad populum fallacy here would essentially state that most people are reporting that the shedding occurs between 0 days all the way up to 3 months. And again, I know it's a fallacy, but I'm only using ad populum or the appeal to popularity here because you have the sort of subset of this online debate that is using ad populum to say the Lock-in colleagues paper is inappropriate, it's way too short, and then they'll say, just look at what everyone is saying on Trestless or whatever subreddit. But why not use ad populum? Why not look into the subreddit to see what people are actually reporting? And once you do that, you will find that, well, the ad populum sort of appeal that people are trying to make to debunk this paper's length doesn't really work, because the actual data shows that most people are reporting shedding between 0 and 3 months. So hopefully that makes sense why this video exists. And yeah, I'm going to stop yapping and let's get on with the video. So, hello everyone, we're actually here in Visual Studio Code. I actually went ahead and wrote a little program to pull posts and comments from the r/Trestless subreddit that mention both creatine and shedding. So let's have a look at this program over here. So here's how it works. It's pretty simple. First, I collected all the posts and comments that had both terms, creatine, shedding, and other sort of slang terms and misspelling, different variations and such. So you can see it over here. Creatine terms, creatine, crea over here, monohydrate, just everything over here, right? We use some regular expression too, and I'll post the code maybe on GitHub so you guys can see for yourself and maybe play with it. But I also made a list over here of shedding terms as well, right? And then I looked for the time references, like after 2 weeks or on day 30, so on and so forth. You can see over here, right? Over here in the duration pattern section, this uses regular expression. And once I had the numbers, I plotted different graphs to see how shedding reports are spread out over time. And we can go to that real quick. But after cleaning the data, I ended up with 426 posts that included a duration. When I looked at those posts, the median time it took for people to report shedding was around 60 days. So I have a window over here that we can kind of look at in one moment as I scroll to it. So over here, right? Duration summary. Median time it took for people to report shedding was 60 days. The average time was a bit higher at around 94 days. So 93.868, so on and so forth. But this I will show you later. There were some parts of the data that kind of pulled up the average due to how significantly long it took for some users to report. Again, this is all anecdotal summaries. Don't take it as scientific fact, but some people reported their shedding at around 1.5 years, right? So that's bringing up the sort of mean days that it took for people to report shedding, the average days. And we can see over here that a quarter of reports essentially stated that shedding happened at around 20 days, and 3/4 stated that shedding happened at around 135 days over here, as you can see from P25 days and P75 days. So percentile 25 and percentile 75, right? And the minimum amount of days it took to report shedding was only 2 days, right? And over here, the maximum amount was 540 days. So again, that 540 days sort of outlier that somebody reported is bringing up the mean average to 94. Anyway, so my overall takeaway before I go in depth into the other graphs is that most reports of creatine-related shedding on Reddit, at least on the trustless subreddit, cluster in the first few weeks to the first couple of months. But there are still plenty of cases, not plenty, not the majority, so to speak, but there's a decent amount that has people reporting shedding after a year and a half, and we'll see that later. But I just want to say this before we look at the other graphs. People have to understand that these are anecdotal reports, they're not scientific. However, for the past, 20, maybe 25 years, people have only accepted anecdotal reports when it comes to creatine and hair loss, right? So how can we accept anecdotal reports of people saying creatine caused their hair loss or their hair shedding within the first 1 to 3 months? How can we say that's valid? But when there's a study that has a methodology specifically for creatine and hair loss, and that methodology essentially is a 3-month-long sort of study, how can we say, well, that is a bit too short, right? That's a bit too short for it to be significant in terms of monitoring any sort of hair changes. When in reality, when you look at how people report shedding with creatine and hair loss, it seems to be that 1 to 3 months is perfectly fine. It's enough time for us to at least capture a signal, a sort of indication that hair shedding is occurring, right? So I'm just giving more credit to the recent hair loss creatine study, where that study pretty soundly debunks the fact, or the notion, not the fact, the notion that creatine causes hair loss. So you guys can calm down a bit. So looking at this graph over here, titled, quote, the distribution of reported shedding onset after starting creatine from R. Trustless, we can see some pretty interesting things about this histogram. So again, these bars over here, these bins, shows us how many mentions land at each time range. The taller the bars means more reports around that time. You can see that most of the bars are tallest in the earlier ranges, right? So the tallest bars tend to be between 0 to 90 days, right? You got some people in between over here, but for the most part, 0 to 90 days, it seems that's when you have people reporting sheds. So 1 to 3 months, 1 to 4 months should be fine, right? And if we are to look at another graph, let me scroll all the way down here, the way down over here. Give me a moment. Doing this ad hoc. Over here, this is just another histogram with a more sort of, more bins, more intricate looks, right? Again, once more, we can see over here, 0 to 21, 0 to 42, 63. Again, most of the sort of complaints are coming between 1 to 3 months, 1 to 4 months, if we're generous, 1 to 5 months, right? But most of it is 1 to 3 months. So in this particular graph, the ECDF graph, and that stands for the empirical cumulative distribution function, we can see the cumulative share of users reporting shedding by day. So what's actually going on here? So the y-axis goes from 0 to 1. So 0% to 100%. And the x-axis is showing us the number of days. So the way we interpret it is this, right? The interpretation is essentially this. At the beginning, the line is flat and you have nobody reporting anything. So essentially over here, right? At the sort of origin point. And then it rises sharply, which means many people reported shedding in that time window, right? So it goes like, whoop, it goes up pretty quickly, right? And when it rises sharply, that means you're essentially seeing a lot of reports coming through, and most of this steep rise is happening within the first few weeks to months, meaning that's when the majority of shedding is noticed by these people in this data set. So by around, let's say, maybe 135 days or so, maybe a bit more than that over here, maybe 168 or so, right? About 75% of all reports have already appeared. So, in plain English, this graph is essentially telling us how quickly people reported shedding after starting creatine. And most of the curve climbs early, which means shedding is usually happening early, according to these people, according to this data set, within the first couple months of creatine use. So that just validates that new creatine study that everyone is talking about, which I'm months late for this particular segment. Okay, so now we're here looking at the box plot, right? So what does the box plot show us? So first, let's look at the y-axis. As it's titled, the y-axis states the days until users reported shedding. And this goes from as low as 0 days all the way up to 546 days. The x-axis over here is just a category label, so I didn't feel the need to split people into different groups. It's just one group's all the mentions. Maybe if I had looked at different subreddits, I could have done r/trestless and so on and so forth, right? But let's look at the key over here. The key over here tells us the yellow line is 25th percentile, the median is the red line, and the 75th percentile is the green line. So the 25th percentile is at around 20 or 21 days, right? Pretty close. And this means that 25% of people in this data set reported shedding within the first 20 days. The red line over here, this red dashed line, is the median. So it took 60 days. So at this point, half of the people reported shedding before 60 days. The top part of the box over here, the blue box, is the 75th percentile. And it is around, I can say, maybe we can say this is 135 days, right? So this means after 135 days, 75% of people reported shedding. And this is around 4 to 5 months. So mostly, right? Mostly you're looking at 1 to 3 months or so from how long it took to people to essentially report shedding, right? That's a perfect range for this new study. And I think it's perfectly fine for us to use that as a sort of rationale to build our methodology on. Now, it would have been nice if they went on to 6 months or a year, but let's not sort of say this study is not that good because it was only for 3 months when all of the anecdotal reports give us a signal that we should see something in 1 to 3 months. So further looking at this plot, we can look at the whiskers, so the lines above the box over here, and the lines below the box. So the lower whisker is down at around, I would say, maybe it's 2 days or so, right? That 2-day thing that we had in the summary report. So that means somebody in this data set reported that they noticed shedding after 2 days of using creatine. Very, very unrealistic, but that's what you get when you play with anecdotes, right? And then we have people reporting shedding all the way up to what could possibly be, I don't know how you would see this. Maybe this is a bit above 294 days. So maybe 200 or 300 days. That's pretty high. But then we can look at the outliers of the whisker plot. So each gray circle is an outlier of people who reported shedding later than most of the people in this data set. Some outliers go up to 540 days, 1.5 years. And these are rare cases, but they are pulling up the average, which is around 94 days. So when you have this thing pulling up the average, right, around 94 days, in reality, the average is lower than that. It's just that you have to take into account the one guy or 2 guys or whatever that reported 540 days or 1.5 years until they noticed their hair shedding due to creatine use. So what this means in plain English is that most people who say creatine caused shedding on Trestless notice it between 3 to 4 weeks, or really a month. So again, let's just say it's between 1 to 3 months, right? Let's just say it's between 1 to 3 months, maybe 4 months, right? It doesn't matter. It's somewhere in that sort of range. We can go back and look at the histogram over here. And about half of all mentions cluster around the 2 month mark. And a few reports are very early. So we have someone reporting 2 days of use, of creatine, and then they're noticing shedding. And then you have the one guy reporting a year and a half of use. Again, it could be due to anything. Now, we do have the violin. It's pretty much showing us, this violin distribution plot is showing us the same thing. We're seeing a huge cluster at the 1 to 3 month range. And it's, again, the same story. I don't really have to go through all these charts to kind of reiterate to this point that the anecdotal reports, if we're going to use them as a justification for the time it takes to cause hair loss due to creatine, then it should be perfectly fine in terms of a methodology window of 3 months when it comes to actually observing creatine and hair loss in a study. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully you guys can understand what I'm saying. I have this sore in my mouth and it really hurts to speak. But yeah, I'm just going to drop this in there. Hopefully my editor can, fix it and put it where it's truly relevant. Anyway, that's it for this part. See ya.